And I was listening to the radio as I came in, and apparently this year, for those who watch such things, this is an extraordinary year for fall colors. Apparently more remarkable, more variety of colors than normal years, which is one of those ironies. God is the artist of that. And here it is all around us, amidst the gloom and the grayness of sickness, suffering, and death, which we don't take lightly. But in the midst of all that, we see God's creative artistry at work as well. Well, what is God up to in the midst of such a time as this? And I said we had 6 themes to pursue, but I cheated a little bit, and this morning is 6B. And it's really focusing on God doing surprising work and works through his people. God doing extraordinary work in and through his people during times of extraordinary hardship. Even if it's a time of judgment, or a time of trial, or a time of suffering, that one theme we see throughout Scripture, from Old Testament to New Testament, is those are the times when it may feel like God is absent, God is distant, but just you wait. He's at work, and he may even choose to use such unlikely, undeserving people as you or me to do his extraordinary kingdom work in such dire times. This morning, I want to look at a pattern we see once again through School of Messiah, Jesus Christ himself. The prophets foresee and foretell that the day of the Lord is going to be a day in some ways filled with dread, gloom, suffering. The Messiah comes with a winnowing fork in his hand. John the Baptist comes preaching. He's got the axe in his hand looking for fruitless trees, and the axe is already at the root. The Messiah Jesus also comes with a healing touch in his hand. Not minimizing, not passing over the message of the need of repentance, recognition of our sin before a holy God, but Messiah Jesus comes with a healing touch. And he even commissions his disciples, empowers his disciples to further that messianic kingdom ministry of healing. Physical, spiritual, both. He commissions his disciples with that messianic power and kingdom purpose as well. This morning we look at a little wrinkle in that development, and it starts with this, I'll call it a precursor. Many a good theologian would say this is actually the main event, and the passage that we're going to focus on is actually the epilogue. I mean, it's something of a precursor, all right. Jesus took 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, up to a mountain to pray. Now, very unusual for them that when they go up to pray, they fall asleep. Actually, it's not all that unusual. That's not the only time that Jesus, in the front row, up close and personal seat, I need you to pray with me. Remember when Jesus is about to be arrested, he takes these same 3 to pray, and they fall asleep. Well, same thing happens here. Well, they wake up to quite a scene. While Jesus has been praying, he is transformed, transfigured in his glorified state. We're going to be looking at this morning these three synoptic gospels that record this series of events: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew 17, Mark 9, Luke 9. Fortunately, in the providence of God, Mark and Luke put it in the same chapter. It's a little bit of a joke, but it is in the same chapter. It's Matthew 17, Mark 9, Luke 9. And it's like the Lord gives us, in these various Gospels accounts, three cameras. It's like three camera angles on the event. Mark is the shortest Gospel, but ironically, Mark records fewer incidents, but the incidents that Mark records, he gives more details. It's one of those ironies, and the same is true here. Well, on this Mount of Transfiguration, Peter, James, and John wake up and find that not only is Jesus transfigured, but he's conversing with Moses and Elijah. And Luke even lets us in on what the conversation is about. Doesn't give us many details, probably because at the time this conversation was being had, the disciples didn't understand most of it. It's like it went right over their heads. But they're talking about what's about to happen in Jerusalem when Jesus is about to depart. That's how it's put. He's about to depart. And they overhear the conversation, and Peter says, you know what? This is great, Jesus. I can set up a tent for you, Moses, and Elijah, three tents or three tabernacles. Apparently, that very week was the Feast of Tabernacles week, when they were celebrating one of the Jewish feasts in which they set up tents and camped outdoors for a week to remind them of when they slept in tents in the wilderness in Egypt, and to remember God's provision for them. Do you know when the Feast of Tabernacles is this year? The Jewish Feast of Tabernacles? Well, we're in October now. Yeah, this year was October 2nd to 9th. It was this past week. It's Feast of Tabernacles. What do you make of that? Feast of Tabernacles. And Peter says, you know what? We didn't come up with enough tents, but it's okay, Jesus. We can get more tents. Mark and Luke let us know that it's kind of a dumb thing to say, but Peter didn't know what to say. He's in the midst of this. Oh my goodness, it's Jesus glorified, and Moses and Elijah. We need more tents. And then a supernatural cloud engulfs them. And as this cloud engulfs them, the six of them, there's a voice from heaven that says, "This is my beloved Son." That's the second time they've heard this voice. First time was at Jesus' baptism. "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." So at Jesus' baptism, it was, "You're my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." Here, the voice apparently is to Peter, James, and John, because the voice says, "Listen to him." Heed what he says. Well, they're terrified and hit their faces, hit the ground. And when they look up, the cloud is gone, and it's just Jesus. Now, I should have given you this hint before. This is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You can do what I did and, put a slip of paper, between the three, but you kind of need a finger or a thumb in all three to read all three at the same time. I'm primarily going to stick with Mark because from here he gives more details, and I've made notes on what the other two fill in that Mark doesn't. But between the three synoptic gospels, we get remarkable details. Mark lets us in on where's Stephen Cho. I got to speak to Stephen through the camera, I guess. Mark lets us in on there's not a cleaner on earth that could get the clothes this clean and white. Huh? That's just for you, Stephen. There's not a bleach on earth that could get it that white. That's the comment Mark makes. Mark also lets us know that Moses is there, but the primary conversation partner is Elijah. But man, Jesus had said the week before, there are going to be some of you, even hearing the sound of my voice, that are going to see the Son of Man in his glory. And a week later, this happens. And this apparently is the seeing the Son of Man. Not just in human flesh, but also revealed in his full, glorified, deified state. Lo and behold, we knew you were the Messiah. We said, that was Peter's confession in Matthew 16. We said, you're Son of the living God. And here it is, the confirmation that you are, in fact, the Messianic Son of God. And then, the next day, they come down from the mountain. Now, Matthew and Mark actually let us in on what they talked about as they're coming down from the mountain. For one thing, Jesus says, you guys probably shouldn't say anything about this until after I've been raised from the dead. At which point, Mark tells us that they really fixated on raised from the dead. What on earth are you talking about? I mean, so there was apparently quite a conversation about raised from the dead. What are you talking about? But Matthew and Mark both tell us that the disciples, Peter, James, and John, had a question of, so we just saw Moses and Elijah. By the way, that's an artist's rendition that's not an actual snapshot. I don't think Moses is actually carrying around the tablets with him, through heaven. That sounds more like purgatory or something than heaven. But just to let you know that that it's Moses is the artist's rendition. But we just saw Elijah. Why did the scribes say that Elijah has to come first? Now, the scribes, by the way, the rabbis, have a point. That's how the Old Testament ends. Malachi, last book of the Old Testament, Malachi 4, last 3 verses of the book of Malachi say, heed the commandments of Moses. That's interesting that Moses is there, isn't it? Heed the commandments of Moses, and before the great and terrible day of the Lord, I will send Elijah, who will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, children to their fathers. So that's how the Old Testament ends, and the scribes say, Elijah's got to come first. And Jesus says, well, Elijah is coming. And by the way, Elijah did come. And then Matthew lets us in on that the disciples were able to accurately, correctly, and successfully connect the dots, that the Elijah, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, Isaiah, was John the Baptist. So they're having a good theological follow-up conversation from this glorious event and seeing the transfigured Christ. But then as they're coming down the mountain, they're confronted once again with real life. and I'll just pause for a second to just observe, that seems to be often the way it can work in the Christian life generally. Just when you have this mountaintop experience of God seeming especially close and powerful, immediately in the aftermath of that, you come down from the mountain and real life hits you right in the face. Remember in our annual Christmas lunch, the 4 cabinet members that I told you about a couple of weeks ago, Dave Dunbar, Pam Smith, Wayne Davidson, and myself, we still get together every year at Christmas, for a Christmas luncheon, reflecting on our old battle wounds and, catching up with one another, what the Lord is continuing to do in our lives. And this past year at our Christmas lunch, when we concluded the lunch, we all said, but I remember Dave Dunbar saying specifically, boy, this year ahead looks like it's going to be a remarkably positive year for pretty much all of us. That was December of 2019. And then January, February, March 2020. And the rest, as they say, is there. Just when it seems the kingdom, the messianic purposes, the transforming power of God in our life is just so close you can taste it. Boom. Real life hits. And in this case, as they're coming down the mountain, they see a crowd and hear an argument. Oh, man. And just that quickly, they're a long way from voice from heaven, Moses, Elijah, and transfigured Jesus. There's a commotion and an argument. And this is what's waiting for them at the bottom of the mountain. A mess. That's what it is. Remember a couple minutes ago, I referred to the fact that the Messianic King Jesus came with a healing touch. He also commissioned his disciples with power to cast out demons, heal people, and it was very successful ministry. Except when they come down from this mountain, there's an unsuccess. Some would call it a dramatic, dismal failure because apparently the disciples had tried to cast out this demon, heal this boy from some dreadful sickness, disease, and the thing wouldn't come out. The boy wouldn't be healed. And so focusing particularly on Mark's account, picking up some details from Matthew and Luke along the way, where germane, relevant, and interesting. What's going on? Well, the father of this boy comes to Jesus and said, I begged your disciples to heal my boy, but they couldn't do it. So Jesus comes near the boy, and the father describes, Matthew uses the language of moonstruck. He's got some weird, supernaturally imposed, from the negative supernatural, occultish, demonic kind of a disease. And Jesus comes near, and this boy goes into convulsions. Colloquially speaking, the boy goes berserk, thrashes on the ground, foaming at the mouth. Jesus does a little, it sounds to me like medical diagnostics. How long has he been like this? Is Jesus probing? Did this boy get involved with the wrong crowd or something? And the father says, he has been like this since he was a child. And furthermore, this demon that's got a hold of him rolls him towards the fire, rolls him toward bodies of waters, trying to drown him or burn him. And in other words, it's not hard to figure out. This is not something that this child has voluntarily gotten involved in and is enjoying or something. No, this thing is plaguing him, even trying to kill him. At which point the father says, if you can do anything, please have mercy and heal him. You know what Jesus' response is? If you can do anything? Is that what you said? If you can do anything? All things are possible to the person who has faith. Now, why would this person have such dismal doubts? Well, for one thing, I'm sure it's not the first time this father, and probably his mother, have prayed for the child. Number two, they took this child to the disciples who tried to cast the thing out, and it failed. So it's not an irrational framing for the father to say, if you can, Jesus. It's almost like when Jesus says to Peter, when Peter has the faith to step out of the boat and actually walks on the water for a couple of steps, but then sees the wind and the waves and sinks in the water, and Jesus picks him up and says, why did you doubt? Peter never answers that question. But I could answer for Peter. Well, because of the wind, the waves, and I've never walked on water before. Do you know the number of times that the Gospels say, and Jesus marveled? Jesus was dismayed at their lack of faith. Every once in a while it goes the other way. When it's a Gentile centurion or a Gentile woman, Jesus was amazed at this person's faith. But oftentimes, what we're told is Jesus was amazed at their lack of faith. And in this case, it's like Jesus says, you want me to heal your boy, but you're saying if. Do you have faith in me or not? Now I want to say to you, kind of from the side of the pulpit, rather than behind the pulpit, I feel the pinch of this passage. I feel the pinch of Jesus' words myself, if you can. Because I know what it's like to wrestle with faith. And I thank the Lord I've never had a demon-possessed child. But it's not hard for me to imagine why this father, even though he's standing next to, he doesn't know it, standing next to Messiah Jesus that just 24 hours ago was transformed in glory, 100 feet elevation higher? I know that that's the case, and I can wrestle in my prayers with, Lord, if you can do something here, have mercy. And I can hear the stinging rebuke of Jesus' words to me. Maybe you can too, if you can. If I'm willing. How much faith do you have? At which point the father immediately gets it and says, I do have faith. I do have faith. Help me with my lack of faith. May I suggest to you that that may be a very good prayer for you and me. I know that every person within the sound of my voice has some faith, or you wouldn't be within the sound of my voice. I mean, there's some reason why you're participating either here in the auditorium or online in the worship service of Christ Life Church. So I know you have some faith. I know it's not no faith. But maybe the appropriate prayer this morning for you is, I have some faith, I have a little faith, but Lord, help me with my lack of faith. I know I should. I know I need more than I have. By the transformative supernatural power of your Holy Spirit, continue to regenerate my unbelieving, unfaithful, untrusting of you heart to give me more faith. At which point Jesus recognizes this crowd is growing bigger. This is about to become a federal case. So Jesus turns and rebukes the demon in the boy directly. Mute and deaf spirit, come out of him and do not go back into him again. And this thing thrashes the boy yet again with a violent set of convulsions. At which point Mark gives us this detail, that the thing leaves the boy for dead. And in fact, he was so still, so much like a corpse, that people in the crowd thought and began saying, kind of muttering to themselves, oh, he's dead. He's dead. By the way, another rotten non-faith response. It's almost like saying, way to go, Jesus, you killed him. When it's other people, I can really be hard on that lack of faith. But how many times have I said, Lord, I prayed for patience, but I didn't pray for this. Way to go. You about killed me. But at that point, Jesus takes the boy by the hand. Honestly, I'm not sure if the boy was dead or not. Not sure it matters. And there's no Dr. Chung to come on the scene and do his vitals, check his pulse. But whatever. Jesus takes the boy by the hand. By the way, this is the third time in 5 chapters that Jesus has reached down and taken the person by the hand and lifted them up. The first was in Mark 5, where Jairus', the synagogue official's daughter, was sick. And while Jesus was making his way to their house, she dies. Jesus shows up on the scene and finds people crying, weeping, wailing, mourning. And Jesus says, it's okay, people. You don't need to cry. She's not dead. She's just asleep. And they laugh at him. So Jesus puts them all out of the house, except for the girl's mother and father and his 3 choice disciples. He goes into this 12-year-old girl who has died in the sleep of death. Jesus takes her by the hand and says, Talitha cum. It's Jesus' hometown Galilee language. It's like Hebrew with a southern accent. Talitha cum. He's speaking Aramaic. That's his native language. Talitha cum. And like, come on, girl, get up. Maiden arise, takes her by the hand, and she wakes up. The second time was in Mark 6, the next chapter, with a little assistance from Matthew 14, who tells us a storm came up on the Sea of Galilee. Disciples are in the boat without Jesus. Jesus walks on the water towards them. Peter calls out and says, if that's really you, Jesus, let me come out to you. Jesus says, come on. Peter does for a few seconds, and then is distracted by the wind and the waves and sinks into the raging torrent. He's a dead man at that point as he sinks beneath the waves, except Jesus reaches down and takes him by the hand and pulls him up and pulls him into the boat and says, man, you have little faith. I'd like to say it's less than I would have. I'm afraid it's more than I would have. I won't speak for you. Would you have the courage to step out of the boat into a raging storm? And yet Jesus says to Peter, you have little faith. You know, you could have made it all the way to me. If you could just could have sustained your faith. Why did you doubt? And this is instance number 3, in which a dead boy, which a dead person, is laying on the ground, laying there helpless. Jesus reaches down his hand, pulls him up. I wonder, in the midst of this awful pandemic situation, are you in a helpless, hopeless state where is Jesus reaching down his hand to you to grab you by the hand and pull you up? Now, later on, and notice we drop out Luke at this point. Only Matthew and Mark let us in on this later conversation. The disciples have the same question that I would have if I were they. You know, Peter, James, and John are up on the mountain. But if I'm Matthew, if I'm Bartholomew, if I'm Judas, not Iscariot, this is the question I have. Why couldn't we cast that demon out? It worked other times. I mean, this was the 9th one of the day. I mean, why couldn't we cast this one out? Well, there's a set of answers that I would expect Jesus to give that he does not. Here's what I half expect Jesus to say in response to this question. Why couldn't we cast that demon out? I kind of half expect Jesus to say, well, didn't do it right. You know, I told you, you're supposed to say, in the name of Jesus Christ, or something. You know, you waited till the end. You didn't do it right. That's not what Jesus says. I kind of half expect Jesus to say, oh, nice try, boys, but only a more advanced level disciple can cast out this demon. By the way, Luke does not record this conversation, but Luke does tell us that shortly after this conversation, or shortly in this range, the disciples did melt down into one of their many arguments of this variety. Which one of them is the greatest? And I wasn't there. I've served on a theological faculty. I've been dean of a faculty, so I know the kinds of things that can be said in such a circumstance. But I'd be willing to guess that one Peter or one James might just have floated out. You know, if I'd have been there, I could have cast it out. You know, if we hadn't been up on the mountain, we could have done it. And there's an argument that melts down. I kind of half expect Jesus to say, well, the only three that could have done it were up with me up on the mountain. But Jesus doesn't say that. Now, I really half expect Jesus to give this answer. Only I can do this type. I mean, he is the one who comes along here. But you know, Jesus does not say that either. Jesus has commissioned them with power. Now, it is his power, that they're stewarding. It's not power from their own strength. But Jesus doesn't say, only I can do it. He does not disabuse them of the idea that the power with which I have commissioned you could have been sufficient. But here's what he does say. Matthew gives one answer, and Matthew and Mark then give the other, which tells me the first answer is not the main answer. Although this is probably the way we're inclined, that this is the main point. But this is the one that only Matthew records. Your faith level is a problem. Your faith level is an issue. And Matthew 17:20, Jesus elaborates. With a little more faith. I mean, that's really what he says. A little more. All it takes is faith of a mustard seed. You actually could command mountains to go into the sea. And you could move mountains. Doesn't take much. Relatively speaking, because that sounds like a lot to me. That tells you how far I have to go, by the way, in school of the Messiah. According to Jesus, with just a little bit of faith, you could move mountains. So, if your faith could grow, you would not have had the frustrating experience that you had. But then Matthew and Mark tell us this. This kind can only come out with prayer and fasting. So the miracle Jesus did was kind of a compression of time kind of miracle. There apparently is such a thing as an especially stubborn demon. An especially stubborn resistance to the force of God's power that can only come out, unless you're Jesus, with protracted, faithful prayer and fasting. So in this pandemic, it may not be that you're doing it wrong. If you're feeling dry, the first week or two of the pandemic, working from home, some of you doing virtual homeschool and whatnot, it's kind of fun the first week or two. Not fun anymore. 8 months ago. It may not be that you're, quote unquote, doing it wrong. And it may not be that you're just not a high caliber enough disciple. So that, what you need is a good guilt trip so you'll be a better disciple. That may not be why you may be in a period of dryness or frustration or sense of distance from God and or God's people, or stagnating in your growth in discipleship. But I am going to ask, based on Jesus' answers to his disciples, what are we doing wrong? How's your faith? That might be the prayer to focus on. Help my lack of faith. Speaking of which, how's your prayer life? By the way, there are a couple of prayer times during the week offered by CLC if you would like to pray with fellow believers. One is on Saturday morning, 7 a.m. Go to the CLC website and check that out. You can zoom in. You can join the group that's praying for an hour on Saturday morning. But otherwise, how's your prayer life? If this kind only comes out through prayer, then that sounds like prayer needs to be a higher priority ministry, discipleship, growth strategy than I typically make it. If this kind only comes out through prayer, in parentheses, some of the textual variants, and fasting, fervent prayer, persistent prayer, faithful prayer. Because I got to tell you, I don't know how much supernatural, devilish, demonic power to attach to this. We have a strong counseling program at Missio Seminary. No one denies the supernatural, but the counselors commonly tell me, Todd, you don't need the devil. You don't need supernatural demons to account for most of the evil and disobedience and wickedness in the world. Our flesh and sinful hearts are plenty for that. But it seems like there are some especially potent, especially stubborn forces of rebellions and resistance in our culture. Just to name a couple. And by the way, I'm saying nothing that's not in the prophets, which we've covered in previous messages. Pride, arrogance. God hates pride. God hates arrogance. He's very resourceful at undermining it. But I tell you what, we live in a proud time with proud people, arrogant people, conveying pride and arrogance as a virtue. And it's stubborn. Selfishness, even to the point of narcissism. Think about me and only me. Greed, consumerism, racism. Didn't we handle that 50 years ago? And yet it persists with almost demonic force and persistence. Immorality, going to keep it PG. Heterosexual, homosexual, immorality, promiscuity. It's one thing for people to stumble and fall and need help and compassion. But we live in a culture that venerates it as though it's something virtuous. Materialism, careerism. Are these demonic forces that may be touching you, your own mind and heart? And/or are these demonic forces that God may have you in place, in position to address, redress in your circle of influence, in your orbit of friends, acquaintances, co-workers? Because these are especially stubborn demons, it seems. And this kind only comes out through prayer and fasting. Let's pray.